And unfortunately for CareerFoundry and myself, this is not a sponsored talk, so keep in mind that this is all based on personal experience and learnings that I gathered for the past years working with the software. Therefore, and knowing that CareerFoundry does provide UI, UX design courses, this is yet another tool in your toolkit that you can use and play around with when exploring those courses. And let's go dive deep into it. And before that, I would like to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be covering over the session. So we're going to check the interface, how it works here. Find out how to combine and edit shapes, so very basic elements, combining how the layout is, what are the styles, and lastly, it will be about the features that make Figma so powerful. A little bit about myself and who's talking here. I've been, as Jakob mentioned, working with CareerFoundry since 2016. So over 4 years as UI design mentor, and I'm also working as lead product designer in several companies in Berlin. We'll see a few of them next. Feel free to follow, as also Jakob mentioned. I'm the Vosk at Twitter and LinkedIn, and Voska Bojnikova at Instagram. And in Berlin, I worked mostly in e-commerce, doing UI, UX design and user research for digital products. And right now, since a couple of months ago, I've joined Flaconi as product design team lead. So we are selling awesome beauty products online and across Germany and Europe. So I'm using Figma daily on a general professional basis since February 2018. So you'll see that there was a lot of improvements and updates, but essentially the core features are still the same, and they're really easy to get the hang of, particularly if you're coming and if you already have experience in Sketch and Adobe XD, you will see that it's a really good, cool and a smooth transition. Why Figma in the first place? So why are we thinking that this could be a good tool? Essentially, it is about having a tool that has centralized all features that are required to work in a digital product team. And also essentially because there is a company, not a company, but a UX tool survey that is made every year, and you see 2020 because the survey is done by the end of the year to find out what tools the designers and teams used. And last year, when presenting a similar webinar at CareerFoundry, we found that Sketch was dominating, but Figma was actually really scaling up. And right now we see that it's actually predominantly present and completely overtook Sketch across the board in many different functions, including brainstorming. So you even see that Figma is in second place to Miro, which is usually used across product and design departments as well. So you see that one tool can do a lot of things, and you also see that it's massively used. So it's always this first element on the bar, and you see that it completely overcame Sketch, who was predominantly in the market for many years. Which tells to me that a lot of companies are switching, bigger teams are switching, and it's pretty much ubiquitous. So if you want to get work in a great design team, most likely they are already using Figma. So better to get a little bit more on board with that. Same for prototyping. You not only can build UI design, you can also do prototypes similarly to Adobe XD and Sketch nowadays as well. And you see that the prototyping trend is just scaling massively, and the usage in Vision is decreasing particularly since Sketch introduced it, but even Sketch is also decreasing as well because teams are particularly switching to Figma. That's my assumption. Then we have also developer handoff, where Zeppelin was the predominant tool in the past year. And nowadays we don't need to use Zeppelin, even though Figma has a Zeppelin plugin, which I really don't know why, but maybe because I stopped using it. So I admit my ignorance there. But for me, from my experience, the Figma handover does pretty much the job, and it's great. Then in terms of design system, building design systems is also dominated by Figma, and there are other tools that also support that, but you see that there's no need to use a separate tool. Lastly, file management, which is something that not many UI software provides. So particularly changing, keeping the files in the cloud and maybe changing the version to something that you were working on the previous day to grab an element or a screen that you had there is also something that Figma allows. The next item on this list is, for example, Google Drive, which you can imagine becomes pretty messy. So if you can just check your file how it was a year ago, it becomes really, really cool. I had at some point a customer asking to make a comparison to the tool that we were designing and send us screenshots from a year ago. And of course, it was much easier to grab it via Figma than actually getting it from development. And rolling back those versions. So we did that pretty quickly. Then, as you see, the tool that most people are excited to try out in this year is Figma, and really, really massively in terms of proportion compared to any other tool. Second place comes Sketch, which for me, I find it interesting. Perhaps it's somebody who's not in the UI and UX design field. Then maybe perhaps we can make a little break and perhaps open some small questions that can come up before we even dive into Figma itself. So in terms of working in tech teams or collaboration across different departments, how can this be enabled? Or maybe something about this UI tool survey. If there are any questions, feel free to shout. I'll be happy to answer those. We will still cover why is Figma the best? Well, we will see that next. There are some features that make it pretty powerful. Essentially is for team collaboration. So if you're working alone in a team, perhaps you're already using Sketch and plugins effectively. It's perhaps it doesn't make sense to switch. But if you have a team where you collaborate, that totally is much more effective. And the same for Adobe XD, right? It's a tool that works pretty well for representing ideas and putting things together alone. But when it comes to collaboration, no longer works so effectively.
Another question we have, Olga, is, can you hear me, Olga? I don't think you can hear me.
Yeah.
Olga, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Another question we have that we actually hear quite a lot from our students: is it enough if I only know Figma and XD? I don't have a Mac. And I think this question is quite relevant. Maybe you can address that.
Yeah, I would say that the Sketch is very similar, but as you see, most teams are already using Figma. So most likely you will end up in a company using Figma rather than Sketch. And if somebody is still using Sketch, as I usually say, which is, I know, quite challenging because some teams are, because there's a lot of things built in already. In that case, it's just a matter of time, in my opinion, because especially with remote collaboration, now that everybody's in lockdown, it's much more effective to use a tool that enables that in the first place.
About how long does it take to master Figma if you're a beginner?
It depends on how interested you are. I usually put this into proportion in terms of how passionate you are about discovering things, how curious you are. So the more you are, the easier it gets. And this is why this webinar, so we'll go in less than 1 hour through the UI, and you will see that it's pretty handy and easy to get the grasp of. We will come up with some examples as well. So I would say it depends literally how much you explore it and how often you use it. So it's very quick. It's just watching a webinar and then forgetting about it perhaps will not do much.
But I always say running these webinars, you can actually create something ready for testing within 1 hour or 2 hours. It's extremely easy, really. What you do, you just basically work with basic shapes.
Absolutely.
When you create a wireframe. Will this tutorial be recorded? Yes, it will be, and we'll be sending you a recording. What's the best benefit of Figma and working with teams of other product designer? I guess maybe talking about collaboration. Will you mention that later?
Yeah, definitely collaboration and handover are particularly the biggest tools. Also, this establishing design systems and making sure that those elements are scalable. It's also a big plus.
Do you think Figma is a good application for brainstorming?
Depends on how you use it. So I use, now that I'm working as a team lead, I do much less UI design and more team facilitation, workshop facilitation. So I do use Figma for those sessions, and there are plenty of plugins and templates already built in by the Figma community, which I definitely use a lot. So we can explore those later on as well.
What is the best way to learn if you don't have specific projects to work on?
So there are UI design challenges online. You can also refer to, for example, looking into a product that you really like and trying to replicate it, and after replicating, improving it. See how can you make it even better.
I think that's it for now. So I'll be coming back a little bit later with more questions to you. Thanks, Olga.
Thanks so much, Jakob. Thanks for jumping in. Awesome. Then I'll quickly swap to the Figma interface. So we can build, as mentioned before, UIs. We can do not only visual design, but can also prototype, view code, and versioning. We can share and collaborate, and we can build components and text and color styles. Looking into UI, we have the tools on the very top here. So basic things that you see is the move and the scale elements. Then we have frames, which you use a lot, which is basically like containers. And they're not particularly artboards. You can use them for artboards. But if you have, if you can also put frames inside artboards. And then you have basic shapes. Then you have the pen tool, but essentially, okay, let's go from the wider scope. You have the tools over here. You can also have the comment function, which we'll see later. Then you have the pages, which right now I only have one, but if I open here and add more, as somebody else opens, they will definitely see this in expanded mode. Perhaps it makes sense to put different, as the project gets more complex, you will end up using more pages. Then we have the layers list, which I do have here. And then we have assets beyond the layers, which at this point, since this is a presentation where I reuse this logo and my name in every slide, I made it as a component in order to be able to change it in only one place if I want to make any changes. Then we have, this is where your team assets and your individual file assets will come up. Then you have libraries, which is shared by the team, essentially. Right now, I don't really have a team for this private computer, but if I would have a design system, for example, it would appear here, and I could actually activate it so that it's included in my file. Then in terms of properties panel, which is the element, the most complex element in UI interfaces, in UI software, and it's usually contextual. So notice that at this point, it's just referencing all the text styles that I'm using in the file, as well as the colors that I defined previously. And I can change the background of the general background of this file. But as I select elements, it will give me indications of those elements and allows me to change the properties of those. So perhaps I can change the background of the slide or export it together. Then, as you see, noticing that there is not only a design side, but also a prototype function here, which means that then my slides are connected. As I zoom out, you'll see that my presentation was built in Figma, and these elements are simply wired together. And that said, together with the inspect mode, which is very handy for developers when doing handovers, because then they can actually select an element, see the spacing between other elements, see the styles that they have. And with all of these functions, it makes it a very powerful software that it becomes much cheaper than having several different products in your toolkit, and also avoids you switching tools all the time. Then it's handy for collaboration as well. So then product owners can start looking at your designs, because people can just jump into this file. I will share the file link here, so everybody will find it that is in this webinar. And feel free to jump in, leave comments. Let's try to see how many people we can get in here. And then you will see that people can, as you jump in, you will probably not see the design and prototype function because I disable that. I will quickly hide my cursors so that I don't see you hovering around in the middle of the presentation, which for me is very distracting personally. Therefore, we can find designers, other designers. If this will be in edit mode, you could also change things on your own, update screens, and I would work on my side and not have any conflicts or not need to merge things. You can also invite customers, so this share functions also allows us to share with people that specific emails. We can give view or edit mode, and we can definitely export. So for example, if I want to share this slide here, I can not only export this single slide, but I can also share the whole presentation and maybe even this part of, so rather the prototype rather than the file itself. And then you can also observe. So for example, I can click on this person, and wherever they go, I can check whatever they're doing and see in detail what they might be working on, what they're interested in. I use this a lot to check also my stakeholders and cross-check if what they're interested in and what they're following. Then got a little bit lost when following people here. So then lastly, we have the comment function, which is pretty cool. We can just go into the artboard and say, oh, I like this element here. How about doing this in I don't know, how about keeping this element in also in this other screen over 2 steps further? And then I post a comment and other people can see it. So for now, I'll just put a test here. And I can also include emojis, obviously. Then we have elements like basic components, like text styles, naturally. We can create text styles out of those. And we can define the color styles as well. So as you see, I already did for this presentation, but particularly the CareerFoundry colors. And in order to create components, I simply select the element, I go into this diamond shape and press it. And then as I duplicate, and you see that it appears, so it's a local component over here. As this element appears, I can duplicate it. And in my layers, you will notice that there is an element over here, which is exactly the same copy of this parent. And if I change the parent, I suddenly decide, okay, I don't like this color, this in white. I would rather have it in a different shape. All the children, as we call them, end up, at least as the developers call them, all the children end up having the same properties. Of course, we can override. Maybe one of the elements needs to be different, and it's still. But then there will be an override function over here. So that's it in terms of creating text components. It works pretty similarly with colors, where I just create a shape and then add that color. So I will just simply put a rectangle with this ugly, boring gray, add with a plus, create, and again, I do this mistake all the time. You can add more than one color. And create different patterns and create really impressive illustrations, as we see the community doing. But then to add a color style, you just go into and create this color style and call it ugly gray, for example, in this case. And then it appears in your layers list. And then if you have this element in your design system, you can then share it with your team library. Then how do we combine and edit shapes? This is the most fun part. So we have frames and we have slices over here. The frames are a little bit like artboards in other tools. So we access them and there's a set of predefined elements coming up over here. And after that, we can define if we want the iPhone 8. And that element just simply appears in our screen. But inside, you might also want shapes inside so to combine groups of elements, which allows you to do more complex things, as we will see later. And that can simply be done by, actually, I need to have a group of elements in order to do that. So that will then, I can frame the selection over here. So in order to combine those elements. Then we have basic shapes like rectangles, ellipses. This is what we use to create more complex graphics. So for example, in order to do a heart, you can just simply start with the circle. You then double click it to remove the points, right? To access the point, you change these points a little bit, and then it becomes a nice little icon that you might use in your UI moving forward. Right. So in here, I then just remove these two elements. Then it becomes a heart icon. And in order to make elements like pie charts, it is even easier. I can simply create a circle, and Figma makes it really damn easy for me. There's a circle that I created here. I press Shift so that it's really a circle and not an oval. And then I simply open up this element here to create the shape. And notice that before I do that, it's Figma still. I will do Command Z so that it's still a circle. And here, notice that the properties panels only display elements for the circle itself. So all I can do is change the size of the circle and maybe change the rotation, which for a circle sounds pretty useless. But maybe it will not be as useless as when I have these elements. For example, if I would have an oval, it will not be useless either. But then other elements appear, right, as I do my pie. And suddenly I can increase and be really, really precise on these values in order to create those elements. So you see that it's super, super cool how easy it is to define pie charts in a graphics tool. So if you're into marketing material and you need to do lots of graphs, this is the perfect tool. Lastly, we have masks and Boolean groups. So essentially, we'll go through the Boolean groups later in more detail, but essentially we want to, and also the masks. So we will see that a little bit in more detail later on. Then, as we proceed, we've seen already frames, slices, right? So we went through all of this. We have also like a keyboard function for each one of those elements so that you get even more productive. And yeah, I went through the demo in one single slide. And the masks and Boolean groups over here, it's as literally as simple as any other UI design tool. So we select the image, we put a rectangle of the part that we want to crop. I will zoom in a little bit so that you can see what I'm doing. And when we select these two elements, we can, sorry, that was my bad. We can, by right click over here, use a mask, or we have the same feature over here. So it's really clear that you can find it in two different places. It immediately creates a mask group, and you can still edit the image. You can still maybe change the position slightly. Maybe I want this angle instead. And then when you export this mask group, you only export this area that you really want, and doesn't come with the full image. This could also be very handy when doing, it could also be, is possible when doing more complex masks. So you can, it's not just with circles and rectangles, but also with more complex shapes that you can also create with the pen tool over here. And this is pretty handy when I have a very long and large image, but I actually want to just use my photo there, and then I can simply crop it out and export it. So it's pretty useful even for non-UI work. Then we have elements like the Boolean groups. So we have union selection. What this simply does is merges the two elements. Then the other shapes can be subtracted. And as you see, I can also change it here, right? I did just clicked on it very quickly, and it created the last element that I did, which was this union selection. And then I could simply go here and change it to the different element that I want. And lastly, we have the exclude, which is I want to remove the area that is overlapping. And this could be pretty handy to make houses, for example, to put a door in a rectangle and a triangle, and that makes a nice real house icon, home icon. Then we have features like auto layout, and you will see that it becomes really powerful already at this very early stage. So things like buttons, which normally we design, but then end up having different text in different places. And when we create this element in the component library, as we change the text, then what happens is the size no longer works, right? Suddenly the element gets broken. Maybe I have a button with more text, and this becomes really annoying. So the way that we fix it in Figma, it's simply using auto layout, which is super powerful. You will see that it's also powerful for categories. So things like, just undo, so that we get back to the nice design we have. We have only a frame and the text inside. And Figma immediately understands that when I click auto layout, I want to make a horizontal because this is only one element that has text. And I can define the spacings in this element and the paddings around it. But the cool thing is that as I add more text, this becomes much more useful. And then we can define to which side it refloats and changes and updates. It could also be helpful for things like having categories. For example, suddenly I might want to change the order of these categories. I simply go to my layers list, I change the size, and they move and they update. So it becomes really powerful. And also maybe I don't want this category anymore here. So the full container becomes immediately smaller. This applies specifically to more complex elements. So you can have auto layouts nested inside auto layouts. And then if you have an error message that is shorter, your whole screen changes and your whole UI gets updated automatically, right? So provided that it's set up properly at the start by whoever designs creates the design system in your team as well. So this is cool. It's much easier than us as designers. We start working on real user problems rather than changing the size of our buttons all the time. Then something that is also powerful is the layout grid, and it's really easy to use. So whoever creates a frame, so by selecting this element, which I provided before as a frame, there is an element here called layout grid. So of course I can create an auto layout, but at this point I want to actually add a grid here. And this grid starts with the base 8-pixel grid, which is standard for material design. So everything that you see on Android has 8-pixel based spacings, but we can also might think that we want to use columns because we're working on a responsive website. Then we might want to set up 12 columns with maybe a margin of, I don't know, 24 pixels, for example, and then have my gutter over here, which becomes then, I don't know, 40 pixels, or maybe, perhaps I should make it 16 so that there's not, the spacing is not so wide. And that's it. And beyond that, you can nest grids inside grids. So if I add a frame inside this frame, I can also apply a second grid. So perhaps I want to split my catalog into different elements. So there would be like 3 columns for perhaps some site navigation, and then the rest, the other 9 columns here, would be for the products that we're selling. And these products, I also want them to be aligned, so I would nest a second grid inside this element here. And the cool thing of the grid is that as sometimes you reshape the screen, the grids also reshapes, and if the elements are placed inside this grid and they're centered to the grids, they will also be updated and adjusted automatically. Other possibilities, particularly when designing, is to change the element and swap them around. So first hand is there's this little circle that I grab, and then I can literally swap things, and you see that Figma kind of tries to guess where I want to place them and tries to move the columns around. This might sound silly, but reality becomes pretty handy when changing images. But before we look at the images, notice that because these elements are all perfectly placed, I have actually a set spacing that I can change here, but I can also visually adjust it slightly. So you see that it becomes really powerful. It's very similar to how Adobe XD does it as well. So it's much easier to update your designs, particularly in cases where you have grids of elements that are similar to each other. The cool thing of this is actually the idea of, okay, I'm designing a bunch of icons and I'm putting them all together, and suddenly I want to change the spacing between them. And if I'm not using auto layout yet, I can simply scale and slide this spacing over here as well. Or maybe I want to swap this icon because I don't really like how it looks like here. I'd rather have it in the middle. So yeah, it's literally this minor tweaks that allow me to really, really enjoy and see how productive my life becomes with so small features that I see over here. So things like, I don't want this image, I'd rather have the dark one so that there's more contrast in between these elements. Then basic shapes can also have stylings like strokes, like fills. So in this case, my fill is this specific color, I can also remove it and define a different color over here that is really granular, or I can go into the color styles that are defined by my design system and select the color from here. They can also be more structured, more organized, as if you're really into structure, you might see that you can even add labels and put your colors in different rows in order to get a more clarity on what is what, especially for very complex design systems. This becomes really powerful. Besides the fill and the stroke that I can also add effects, like maybe perhaps this is an element that I want to have a little bit of shadow over here, and I will increase substantially the spread so that we can see that. But perhaps with that it becomes even blurrier, right? Maybe I want to do something that is more dramatic and larger over here. So you can add all these effects over here. Then the cool, I'm struggling with using this Mac myself. After that, after I fix my usability issues with my own system, I can show you how we do effects that are really closer to mobile and native applications. So beyond the drop shadow, we have options like background blur. And background blur is this effect that really comes handy because perhaps I have a text and I have a background. So that the text doesn't interfere with the image. But perhaps I find this background too stiff, and I don't want to have a gradient because it just looks super old school. But perhaps I want a background that is not so heavy. And with the blur, what it does, it's simply increasing the legibility, right, of this element. So suddenly my text can be much more readable, despite I can still see through the image, and it's not such a stronger contrast in terms of the element itself. And in this case, perhaps I want to use something softer, for example, like here. And if we place the text here, it becomes much more readable because we're naturally blurring the background here. And you will see that used in iOS as well in their headers and menus. Then in terms of features that make it really, really powerful, and what I really enjoy mostly in Figma is things like autosave. So when you press Command S, Figma reminds it that you don't need to, because they do this, right? And it's actually pretty handy. And that's something that we lose lots of files, or from my previous experience, we end up having to redo some stuff. And here, if suddenly I don't know, my computer shuts off by itself, Figma will likely have saved a very recent version, if not the latest version of what I was working on over the last minute before that happened. So Smart Animate is also a feature that becomes super powerful, as you see throughout the presentation. I do have some titles going back and forth. So between this slide and this other slide, there's a text that moves in or above. And the way that it works is simply I have a separate text. And because the layer name is the same, Figma understands that in one screen, the text is over here, while the next screen, the text is above. And despite even me using a different font style, Figma understands that because the text name is exactly the same, or the layer name is exactly the same, it moves it automatically, and I don't need to do anything there for it. I simply define the transition between the elements. So in order to make this animation, I would simply link these elements and then select here Smart Animate. And then I can even be more precise in how many milliseconds, etc. But the default is already pretty good and also very useful for accessibility, so that it doesn't get too slow or too quick, or at least too quick for the users not to even see it. Then we have, besides the animations, which are really cool and the whole topic on its own, we have things like the version history. So if I click this little arrow next to the title, I can look into the history of this file and see what kind of edits there were. I can restore a version, I can duplicate a version, and I can copy elements from that version to my latest file as well. That comes very handy. Then there's this feature that I call for sloppy designers, which there are a lot of them out there, and it's normal because sometimes the time is not the ideal and we have really tight deadlines. But perhaps a very handy tool would be the tidy up. So we have it in a range over here. We also have it with right click. What it does, as you saw, the elements weren't really exactly in the right place. I will just do Command Z and zoom in. You notice that this element is a little bit off. Everything is a little bit slightly off, but almost there, but not quite. So we can go through the main navigation, or we can tidy up, or I thought we could tidy up here, but that's my bad. So there was a function somewhere and I completely lost it. But yeah, there is definitely a shortcut as well for it. So if you need to use it often, tidy up is your best friend. Then things like because this tool is web-based, it's based on the browser, all these benefits are exponentially combined. Beyond that, there's also a native app that you can download. The files are still web-based, so it means that they will still be auto-saved. You can open your file, not have any internet, continue working on it. It will reconnect as soon as you get internet back again. The advantage is, even with the local, at least from what I've seen on my computer performance, even with the local app, it takes the full performance of the machine. So if you have a really powerful machine, it will not get stuck to whatever the browser allows it. It will still enable to take the full potential of your hardware. So the more powerful your machine is, the more powerful Figma will take out of, and more productive it will be. Then we have things like constraints, right? So besides the auto animate, we have elements over here which tell us, okay, this is how we want this box to behave. Meaning that at this point, if I resize the outer element, in this case, it's the full slide, this message over here will stick to the bottom and stick to the size that it has to the bottom, which is this distance, and it will be centered. So let's try it out. I will just select the frame, zoom out a little bit, and resize it. And notice that it does exactly what I wanted to do. Why is this helpful? Because sometimes we want a menu on the top, a footer on the bottom, and we want our content to be more flexible. Perhaps we want a model that is centered. Perhaps we want this button here on the bottom left and this other button here on the bottom right. But also, because I'm using auto layout, notice that I don't have that option, because then it's defined by the size of the text, and that's why it reflows. But for elements that are not auto layouts, then we can definitely, so in this case, because the outer frame is not an auto layer, then we can definitely add these constraints over here and tell Figma how we want this element to be when resized. So as you can see, it becomes really powerful in terms of responsive design. Then plugins. My favorite plugin would be Unsplash. I use it for all things, not just work related. Maybe I want to download a nice image, which is actually free from Unsplash, and then I can export it, and I can print it, and I can make my own posters at home, whatever. So the way it works is I simply select, I need a frame. I need to tell Figma where I want this image to be placed so that it also downloads with the sizes. And while we wait for it to run, I can also tell you that another plugin that I use nowadays much more often that I never used before is the timer plugin. So we do have the timer function. Finally, we have Unsplash. My computer is going a little bit crazy right now with both PicMarker open and Figma. So we can first randomly select an image and just select an animal it will put here, or I can search for a specific, for example, colorful image, and then select the image that I want to be placed over here, which probably becomes more handy. As you see, this image looks very familiar to that star, so you know where I got it from. And then, of course, it will be cropped. So perhaps here we will get something that is a little bit more horizontal in this frame. So there you go. This is a really handy plugin, and one of my all-time favorites. As I was saying, my second and nowadays the most used plugin is the timer. If you don't have the font, this basically the way you get it is you go to the Figma community, you go into the files or the plugins, both actually, you need both. You need to find the file where you get the timer elements, and you then also activate the plugin itself. And notice that you will see that this will not work because there's no font, but this font is free, you can download it. So I will just do the demo on this other element here. So the way it works, I need to select my text element because Figma doesn't know where I want to run my timer. There might be plenty of text elements, but all it needs is a text element. You don't even need this timer, this cool looking timer down here. You simply need a text element. And then you run your timer and you start it, and you will get a countdown, in this case, for 13 seconds. The only issue with this specific layout, because it has something here in the middle, you will see that when it gets to done, it no longer has a nice looking layout. It looks a little bit broken. But for this timer, which is the one that I use with my team, it's perfect and it looks amazing. So I would definitely recommend that if you do some workshop facilitation. It's really, really cool. Then a little bit of something that not everybody notices right away. You can open a new, or you can actually get a new file. Sorry, you cannot. Oh gosh, I forgot how to speak. You can have a new window rather than basically, rather than creating a new file, you might want to see this file and have like a very zoomed in version, which is where you're working, and then you see the big screen, which is the final layout. And you might have one in one monitor and one in another, or side by side. You will have your mobile version on the very bottom of your screen. So it's really cool to be able to actually see this this element combined, like side by side. So then beyond that, we have properties like simultaneous collaboration, as mentioned before. As I could potentially have this file editable, you could, for example, change the font style here while I'm working with other elements. And that's pretty much it in terms of how cool Figma is. I'll quickly get back to the presentation over here, which I see that somebody is already following. And also the cool thing that Figma does is if you click on the profile photo of the other user, you can follow them. So as people go through the presentation, they see exactly where you're clicking and where you're going. So you can run through a whole presentation, have people following you online. It's exactly the same as within the file, but in a prototype. Okay, then moving forward, if you really enjoyed this and you want to explore Figma in more detail, feel free to check out CareerFoundry's UI program. There you can learn more. You can use Figma for your projects during the course as well. And reach out for discount code if you're watching this on YouTube.